One of the most nerve-wracking parts of designing your own game, whether that's a tabletop role-play game or video game, is the testing process, where you actually let other people play your game and give you their thoughts. And what can make that process even harder is not knowing how to approach people who are going to be your playtesters, how to describe what you need from them, or if you're a playtester yourself, how to communicate with a designer and make sure that they understand your feedback effectively. This is something that I've seen firsthand both as a tester and a game designer, and it can really make the testing process arduous. So today, I would like to provide you all with 3 tips for how to ask playtesters for feedback, and 3 tips for how you as a tester can provide effective feedback yourself. And then at the end of it, I'm going to wrap it up with something a little bit philosophical if you stick to the end on that. All right, let's jump in and talk testing principles. Hello, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and I have been playing tabletop role-playing games for about 25 years now, and over the last several years I've been doing a lot of my own game design, running tests, and being a tester in other people's tabletop games. So we're going to go through what I have learned through that process and see if we can help fast-track you all to getting actionable test information during your playtests. So if you're the designer, here are the 3 tips that I'm going to unpack. 1 is keep the test focused. 2 is communicate to the players what you want them to pay attention to. And 3, to take it all in stride. So let's unpack each of those one by one. Tip 1, keep the test focused. I've been involved in a lot of playtests where the person designing the game has sent over a 150-page document for me to review for a playtest the following day, expecting me to jump into the whole game as a whole right away, which is a lot to ask a player and makes it hard for them to know what they should be paying attention to. And expecting them to read your whole manuscript just for a 2-hour playtest isn't being very respectful of their time either. They're giving up some of their valuable day to help you design your game, usually for free, so you don't want to make them do a ton of homework before the session. Instead, do things like provide a set of pre-gen characters for them to pick from, create a reference sheet or one-pager, or a quick start manual for them to go over. And don't run a test that is just a grand adventure, like a whole campaign that would take place over a dozen sessions. Instead, pick a one-shot that really narrows your focus into the mechanics you're looking to test specifically, whether that be character creation, a specific monster design, a class design. Keep the test on track and narrow in its application so you can test those features isolated from the rest of the game. This is the approach I took with Tales from Elsewhere. Instead of giving people the 200-page draft manuscript, I created a 1-page document that summarized most of the key rules you would need, something they could just have at the table and reference easily. And then I put together a quick start guide that the core rules only occupied about 10 pages of content, and it would be enough for the players to sit down and play the game. Then I made a set of pre-gen characters, all specifically tailored for the tests I needed to run. That way, I'm not testing elements that I don't care about, things that aren't necessary, like the character creation process if I'm working on a certain combat engine or needing to test a certain monster. It keeps things narrow and focused, and I've had great success showing up to conventions or events and having people just sit down, having never heard of my game before, and playing a session right then and there, just because I put together these easily accessible documents. And if you want to see examples of those documents that I've created for various playtests, there's a link down below to the Tales from Elsewhere playtest packets. I also created a quick start guide for character creation to specifically test character creation. So it's a separate document that players who are already somewhat familiar with the game could read and just use that to test characters. But even then, I didn't provide all 50 backstory elements and 130 edges in that document. I put less than half of all of that in there to keep the testing focused at this stage, because you don't want to overwhelm these playtesters and get a bunch of junk data. The caveat with this first tip is that eventually you will want to test a long-form campaign with your rules. Very important step in the testing process for tabletop role-playing games. When you're ready for that stage, though, you'll present that to the players so they know what they're getting into. You don't want to start out with somebody who's never even experienced the game and expect them to commit to 3 to 4 months of their time. That's a step for later and would be, in and of itself, very focused in what content you should have in it. Tip number 2, tell them exactly what they're there to test. And what I mean by that is, don't play coy with them and say, you're just going to play my game. Tell them, in this playtest, I'm going to be handing everybody pre-gen characters, and we're going to see how my redesigned zombies work in a classic haunted house scenario. Tell them exactly what that's going to entail. Let them know that we're going to be testing combat, there's not going to be much roleplay, we're going to be fighting zombies, and we want to make sure that they stay focused on that experience when they're playing the game. Making sure the players have the right expectations about what they're going to do can really help keep their feedback positive and focused. This is somewhat of a non sequitur, but I remember when the movie Ex Machina came out many years ago, all the advertising made it seem like a straight-up horror movie, rather than more of the cerebral, suspenseful drama that it was. So when I saw it in the movie theater, going in expecting juicy horror, I was actually disappointed with the film because I didn't have my expectations set correctly. I of course came to appreciate the film later on for what it was, but having the wrong expectations going into a playtest can often get you bad feedback because the players aren't looking in the right direction. Now, that's not to say that you have to be focused only on crunchy mechanics or combat systems in your playtests, but let the players know ahead of time if they're going to be digging into a highly narrative experience, or if they're not expected to be doing any fighting in that test. You want them to know what's going on. Because unlike in a normal long-form campaign or adventure where they're there to discover the adventure and discover the narrative organically and immersively, a playtest is there to iron out systems and gameplay experiences, not necessarily to tell a grand story. Tip number 3 is to take things in stride. And what I mean by that is not just to have thick skin necessarily and understand that other people aren't necessarily going to enjoy the game to the level that you have, but it's to understand what type of feedback you may be getting from the players and filter it appropriately. You're going to hear a lot of feedback from playtests. Some of it won't be useful, some of it will miss the point. And the important thing is to not argue with the playtesters on that subject. Don't try to convince them that their perceptions were incorrect about your game. Instead, you want to try to get to the underlying experience they had, the vibe or lack of fun that they may have experienced that may be at the heart of what could be a poorly communicated feedback point. The key there is to not disagree with the playtesters. You should thank them for that feedback and tell them that's really helpful and it's given you lots to consider. You're not there to argue with them and disagree. They may have just missed the point, potentially, of the test, and maybe they're overstepping a bit and entering designer mode rather than just tester mode, and you don't want to get too hung up on that, because oftentimes the players are going to communicate what wasn't fun for them. Even if their understanding of the mechanics or their recommendations on how to fix it may not be quite in line, they clearly had an experience during your playtest that you should pay attention to and understand why they may have felt the way they did. So asking those kinds of probing questions of the playtester in a respectful and compassionate way can help reveal really interesting nuggets that you may have missed if you get bogged down in arguing about dice resolution systems. Now, I've actually had very positive feedback experiences with my playtesters over the years, even when they've maybe disagreed with me or given me a reality check about a design in my game. I get a lot of different types of feedback and tales from elsewhere, from public playtests to ones in my Discord server, and even talking one-on-one with some of my patrons over on the Tales from Elsewhere Patreon server, where they get access to early builds and design documents and get to hash them out with me from time to time. So if that interests you, you should definitely check that out. But if you provide your playtesters with the following 3 tips I'm about to describe, it can help them have their mind in the right place to be a good tester. All right, the 3 tips I'd like to provide to potential playtesters are to 1, take notes, 2, provide feelings, not suggestions, and 3, it's not about you. So let's dig into all these. Tip number 1, take notes. This is going to come off as maybe like a boomer take for a moment here, but you should always be ready to take notes when you're in a meeting or in a playtest or at an event. It keeps you just so organized and thorough and also makes you come off more professional. When it's time to actually give your feedback, having those notes in front of you can keep you organized and make it really look like you know what you're talking about. When I'm a playtester in a game, I take notes in 3 sections. Notes about the session, notes about the character, and notes about the rules. So for the session notes, I unpack my notes and thoughts on how the session went, what we were actually there to cover, whether or not it was fun, enjoyable, how was the pacing. The character section, I'll dig into my own character's mechanics, how effective they were, how easy they were to understand, notes about its specific abilities. And then the rules notes are where I put questions and comments and concerns about the rules as I see them when I'm playing. What seemed onerous to calculate? Where were there too many steps in the die resolution? All those kinds of things fall into those categories. Then when I'm ready to present that to the designer, I can just provide them in a really organized way. And having such thorough notes actually means I can pay attention to the game more and have more fun because I'm not worried about trying to remember things I want to talk about later. I just jot down a quick note about something that comes to mind and I'm back in the game and ready to go. I'm not worried about whether or not this is going to come up again or whether or not that was worth noting down. I just note any spare thoughts I have, keep it in a little notepad either at my desk or on the computer, and it's waiting for me at the end of the test. And as a designer, I love receiving these well-organized and detailed notes. It makes my job so much easier, and it makes it so much easier to parse them, especially if I can't have a sit-down, like a one-on-one talk with a tester after a playtest, if they just have to give me their notes and run. Having them that well formatted is a godsend. It is the best, and you will become everybody's favorite playtester if you do just that one tip. Tip number 2 is to give feelings, not suggestions. And let me unpack that because it does sound a little weird. What I mean by that is, let the designer know how the various experiences felt to you as you were playing. What didn't feel fun? What did feel fun? What moments made you feel badass? What moments made you feel sad? What were frustrating? And what parts of the game made you feel the feelings that the designer informed you they wanted to evoke? Were you scared or tense in the horror scenes? Were you laughing in the comical ones? Let them know how those experiences read to you as you were playing the game. And remember that the goal is not to provide them a recommended course of action to remedy the experience you had if it was negative. It's to help point them in the direction so they can help design a solution. An example would be if you found that a character class was underpowered that you were testing. You felt like all the other players were more interesting and cool and had more fun toys. Don't start listing off your ideas on how you could fix it. Just tell them that you felt slightly inadequate in comparison to these other characters. You noticed that they had all these powerful movement abilities or dramatic spells, and your character felt like they weren't able to meaningfully contribute. But you're not actually going to tell them how you think they should scale up the damage values on this ability or that, but let them know how much of a wet noodle it felt to use one of their powers, as an example. Because remember, your job as a playtester is not to be a game designer. It's to help the designer see flaws or great things about their game. So letting them know how your experiences work can help the designer do their job. When you, as the playtester, start overstepping that, it actually makes the testing process more onerous for the designer, more difficult, because then they're getting lost in the weeds of discussing your specific implementation rather than brainstorming their implementation for their rules at large. As you, as the tester, may not have the full context of the whole rules because the playtest was focused. You want to let them do their job, and you do your own. The third tip for being a playtester is to remember it's not about you. What I mean by that is, remember that this is the designer's game and they have certain design goals, and those goals may not actually align with your own culture of play, your own preferences at the table, or your preferred style of games. And that's okay. For example, I've played in a variety of playtest sessions on a number of games over the last several months, and they really run the gamut. I playtested a game called Neuroshell that is a very abstract game meant for 1 or 2 shots, where the players are each part of the fragmented mind of a single character, gesturing toward and inspired by Disco Elysium. A little different than the action horror Weird West game I'm working on. Or I participated in a few playtests of Peasantry, which is a comical, nonsensical game about being filthy peasants getting into mischief. And I've playtested in a session of Indominant, where you're playing as heroic characters who team up to take down bad guys in a very crunchy and tactical superhero game. All of these don't necessarily appeal to my own design aesthetics as a game designer, but I had to make sure to put my head in their spaces when providing them feedback, as the kind of feedback I would give Zarek at Indominant isn't particularly useful for Zachary working on Peasantry. Totally different games, different design goals, and I kept that in mind when providing my own feedback to them. And if you're lucky like I am to talk to so many designers and see all these wildly different designs, you have to remember that they're not making the game for you, right? They're making the game that they want to make. And we need to make sure that we're providing helpful feedback for their design principles, which is why they need to proactively communicate with you about what those principles are, so that you're giving the correct kind of feedback. I wouldn't expect somebody who is playtesting my game to understand that I'm only interested in very specific action or visceral combat experiences if I didn't communicate that to them ahead of time, especially if they're themselves working on something more abstract or narrative-focused or whimsical for that matter. It's about communicating that ahead of time in both directions. And that segues into Old Man Peter here's life tip for you. This is how you can get through all of life communicating with so many different people and always come off as helpful and insightful and useful, the kind of person that other people are going to want to interact with. So here is the life hack I'm going to give you. Proactively communicate with compassion. It's as simple as that. When you're talking to others, communicate what you need and what your thoughts are proactively. Don't wait to be asked. Let people know your approaches in life. Let them know what you're all about. Let them know where your perspective is coming from. And do so with the understanding that they're going through the same kind of stuff you are, having the same difficulties in communication and struggling to take what's in their mind and give it to somebody else and have it received the correct way. And this can be very challenging because when you're doing this kind of communication, like me to you over YouTube, or in my Discord server, on Patreon, or in the YouTube comments, there's this separation between us, this almost solipsism of the people out there aren't real, and they don't have the same experiences that I'm having. And that comes down to one of the best lessons that I've also learned about this form of communication. We judge others based on their actions, and ourselves based on our intentions. Really let that sink in. Learning that lesson will help you as a game designer and a tester, because you'll understand that everybody else is judging themselves based on their own intentions. And so you need to communicate your intentions to others as they're judging you based on your actions. Identifying that helps dispel the solipsism that's so common here on the internet and in human communication in general. Well, thank you for indulging that little aside about philosophy. I do appreciate it if you've made it this far in the video. It's a lot of fun to put these together, and you, the viewers, make it all possible. It's really great. Your comments, you joining the Discord server and talking to me there, or hopping on the Patreon to help vote on upcoming art commissions, or help me with designs, all of that communication and connection I have with all of you means the world to me. So again, thank you all so much, and I will see you next week on Tales from Elsewhere.